You've entered void of rules, where chaos reigns and darkness consumes all. In this twisted realm where all laws have crumbled, only one rule remains, and those who break it are cast into eternal digital oblivion. The rule is simple. Subscribe. We're almost at 3,000 corrupted souls, but the void hungers for more. Our goal is 10,000 subscribers before this year bleeds into darkness. Will you join our legion, or face the consequences of defying the void? Now let's jump into today's story. The letter arrived on a Wednesday morning in March, slipped beneath my apartment door while I slept. No postmark, no courier signature, just my name written in precise Latin script across cream-coloured paper that felt ancient beneath my fingertips. The parchment carried the faint scent of myrrh and something else, something that reminded me of old graves and forgotten prayers. Inside, a single line in the same careful script. Cardinal Francesco requests your presence at midnight. Come alone, bring your instruments. I'd been expecting this summons for weeks, ever since the whispers began circulating through the Vatican's shadowed corridors, like smoke from a dying fire. Something was stirring in the remote corners of Eastern Europe, something that required the particular skills of men like myself. Men who understood that the Church's work sometimes extended far beyond prayer and communion into territories where angels feared to tread. My name is Father Adrian Mallory, though most who know my true profession simply call me the confessor. For 15 years I have served as part of Operazione Malachia, a secret order within the Vatican tasked with handling what our superiors euphemistically term irregularities. Priests who have strayed too far from orthodox teachings. Clergy who dabble in knowledge that was forbidden for good reason. Men of God who have forgotten which God they truly serve. It is work that requires a particular temperament, faith strong enough to withstand exposure to heresy, yet flexible enough to adapt when doctrine meets reality in its darker forms. We are the Church's immune system, sent to eliminate infections before they can spread to the broader body of believers. I spent that day in preparation, cleaning my weapons with the same reverence I once reserved for preparing the Eucharist. My service pistol, a Beretta 92 FS, modified by Vatican artificers with a grip bearing the papal seal, each component blessed by 3 different cardinals. Consecrated ammunition that had been soaked in holy water from the Jordan River and inscribed with passages from the Book of Revelations. A combat knife forged from steel that had been melted down from the chains that once bound St. Peter himself, its edge honed to a sharpness that could split both flesh and certain kinds of spiritual essence. These were the tools of my trade, sanctified instruments for sanctified work. I maintained them with obsessive care, understanding that my life, and more importantly my soul, depended on their effectiveness. As evening approached, I attended Vespers in the small chapel reserved for members of our order. The service was conducted in Latin, so ancient that even most priests would struggle to follow it, the words worn smooth by centuries of repetition. Around me sat perhaps 20 other men, all bearing the same subtle marks of our profession, calloused hands that spoke of weapon maintenance, eyes that had seen too much, and the particular stillness that comes from having killed in God's name. We did not speak to each other. We had learned that intimacy was a luxury our work could not afford. As the clock in St. Peter's Basilica chimed midnight, I made my way through the Vatican's labyrinthine passages to Cardinal Francesco's private study. The corridors were empty at this hour, lit only by ancient sconces that cast dancing shadows on walls lined with centuries of sacred art. My footsteps echoed softly on marble floors, worn smooth by countless pilgrims and penitents, the sound seeming to whisper secrets in languages I didn't recognize. The cardinal's door stood slightly ajar, warm lamplight spilling into the hallway like honey. I knocked twice, paused, then knocked 3 times more, the traditional signal of our order, derived from Peter's threefold denial of Christ. "Enter, my son." Cardinal Francesco sat behind an enormous oak desk that had reportedly belonged to Pope Alexander VI, his hands folded before him like a man in prayer. In the lamplight, I could see that his fingertips were blackened, as if burned by holy fire, a condition that had worsened progressively over the years I had known him. Local rumours suggested it was stigmata, but I knew better. Some kinds of knowledge left physical marks on those who possessed them. His eyes, once a warm brown that had drawn confessions from the most hardened sinners, now reflected nothing but darkness. Not the absence of light, but the presence of something that existed in the spaces between illumination. Something that had been watching from behind those familiar features for longer than I cared to contemplate. "There is work that needs doing, Adrian. The kind that cannot wait for morning prayers or episcopal approval." Without ceremony, he slid a manila envelope across the desk. The paper was thick and expensive, sealed with red wax bearing the sigil of our order. A sword crossed with a crucifix, surrounded by thorns that seemed to move slightly in the flickering candlelight. Inside, I found photographs, documents, and testimonies that would have seemed impossible to anyone outside our organization. The target was a priest named Simeon Petru, a man whose story read like something from the apocryphal texts we spent so much effort suppressing. "Once he was our brightest mind," the cardinal began, his voice carrying the weight of old disappointments and older regrets. "A theologian whose understanding of scripture was matched only by his hunger for hidden knowledge. We sent him to Romania in 1983 to investigate reports of a heretical text, an apocryphal gospel supposedly bound in human skin and written in the blood of martyrs who had died screaming rather than recanting their testimonies. I studied the photographs as he spoke, noting details that trained eyes would catch. Father Simeon appeared to be a man in his 40s, tall and gaunt, with piercing dark eyes and sharp features that suggested both intelligence and something less wholesome. What troubled me immediately was that these photographs spanned decades, yet he appeared identical in each one. Not aged, not weathered by the passage of time, but exactly, impossibly the same. He found what he was looking for in a monastery, deep in the Carpathian Mountains, the cardinal continued, his blackened fingers drumming against the desk in a rhythm that reminded me uncomfortably of funeral dirges. But instead of destroying it as ordered, he began to study it, to translate it, to practice what it taught. He paused, and something behind his eyes seemed to stir with remembered hunger. That was 42 years ago. We lost contact with him shortly after his final report. "And now?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "Now the locals speak of a man who matches his description exactly, gathering followers in the same monastery where he vanished. They call him Cel care nu dorm, the one who does not sleep, and claim he appears unchanged by the decades that have passed." I examined the more recent photographs with growing unease. Surveillance images taken by local authorities showed a figure standing at crossroads outside remote villages, always at night, always motionless. Witness testimonies from Romanian peasants spoke of a tall priest who would appear without warning, speaking in tongues that predated Christianity. Grainy footage from hiking cameras captured glimpses of someone moving through the forest with inhuman grace, always just at the edge of visual clarity. In every single image, the resemblance to the 40-year-old photographs was unmistakable. "The village priest in Ramnicu sent this just last week," the cardinal continued, producing a final photograph that made my blood run cold. It showed a figure standing at a crossroads outside the village, tall and motionless in the moonlight. The image quality was poor, obviously taken from a distance with a telephoto lens, but the face was clear enough to identify. More disturbing than the identity, however, was what surrounded the figure. The shadows seemed wrong, too deep and too dark for the amount of light available. And if I looked closely, which I found myself reluctant to do, those shadows appeared to be moving independently of their source. The local authorities have reported 17 missing persons in the past 6 months, the cardinal continued. All were last seen walking toward the mountains after encountering this figure. Search parties found no trace of them, but hunters in the area report seeing lights in the monastery windows, lights that burn without flame or fuel. He met my eyes with that empty stare that had replaced his once compassionate gaze. Your orders are absolute, Adrian. Find him. End him. Burn everything he has touched, whatever he has become, whatever he has done, whatever he serves. It ends now. I gathered the materials and stood to leave, but the cardinal's voice stopped me at the door. Adrian, he said softly, and for a moment something almost human flickered in those dead eyes. Be careful. The reports from that region speak of things that should not be possible. Men who walk through solid walls. Voices that speak from empty rooms. Lights that burn in colours that have no names. He paused, his blackened fingers tracing symbols on the desk that I recognized from certain forbidden texts. Remember that faith is both your greatest weapon and your greatest vulnerability. In that place, belief itself becomes a double-edged sword. I nodded and turned to go, but his final words followed me into the corridor. And Adrian? If you find yourself beginning to understand what Simeon discovered, if you start to see the larger patterns at work, remember that some knowledge cannot be unknown. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. 3 days later, I found myself on a commercial flight to Bucharest, carrying nothing but a single duffel bag and a diplomatic passport that would ask no inconvenient questions at customs. The flight was uneventful, filled with tourists and business travellers who had no idea that they were sharing their cabin with a man whose luggage contained enough blessed ammunition to level a small building and sanctified weapons that had been consecrated in blood and prayer. During the 8-hour flight, I reviewed the case materials again, committing every detail to memory. Simeon's academic background was impressive. Degrees from the Gregorian University, advanced studies in biblical archaeology, recognition as one of the Church's foremost experts on apocryphal texts. His early work had been exemplary, producing translations and analyses that had strengthened Orthodox doctrine, rather than challenging it. The change had come gradually, according to his personnel files. His later papers began to question established interpretations of Scripture, suggesting that certain passages had been deliberately mistranslated to obscure their true meanings. He had requested access to texts in the Vatican secret archives that were restricted even to high-ranking clergy. His correspondence with other scholars took on an increasingly urgent tone, as if he were pursuing some crucial revelation that always remained just out of reach. The final report he had filed from Romania was brief and cryptic. Have located the reference materials. Initial translation confirms our worst fears and greatest hopes. Request immediate permission to proceed with full analysis. The implications for church doctrine are unprecedented. No further communications had been received. Bucharest proved to be a city caught between worlds. Gleaming modern buildings standing alongside Soviet-era concrete blocks, all of it shadowed by the distant peaks of the Carpathian Mountains. The atmosphere felt heavy, oppressive, as if the very air carried the weight of too much history. I spent the night in a hotel near the airport, studying maps and planning my route while trying to ignore the way shadows seemed to linger longer than they should in the corners of my room. The next morning, I rented a Land Rover from an agency that specialized in vehicles capable of handling Romania's more challenging terrain. The clerk, a young woman with nervous eyes, asked no questions about my destination, but crossed herself when I mentioned the Carpathian region. She included extra supplies, rope, emergency flares, a satellite communicator, without charge, refusing my attempts to pay with a vehemence that suggested superstition rather than generosity. "The mountains are dangerous this time of year," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. "Many people go up there. Not so many come back down." The drive into the mountains took most of the day, following routes that seemed to grow progressively older as I climbed higher. Modern highways gave way to 2-lane roads, then to gravel paths that wound through increasingly dense forest. The landscape changed with each mile, as if I were travelling backward through time itself. Villages became smaller and more isolated, their inhabitants watching my vehicle pass, with expressions that mixed curiosity with something that might have been fear or recognition. Technology began to fail as I climbed higher. My GPS lost signal somewhere near a village so small it didn't appear on any official maps. Cell phone coverage became sporadic, then non-existent. The radio picked up only static interspersed with fragments of broadcasts in languages I couldn't identify, speaking words that seemed to bypass my ears and resonate directly in my bones. I stopped for directions in Ramnicu, a collection of perhaps 50 houses clustered around a small Orthodox church whose bells had been silent for decades. The response to my inquiries was immediate and deeply unsettling. The moment I mentioned the monastery, conversations stopped. Children were quickly ushered indoors. Adults crossed themselves and began speaking in rapid Romanian that my limited vocabulary couldn't follow. An elderly woman approached my vehicle as I prepared to leave, her weathered hands gripping a wooden crucifix so tightly her knuckles had gone white. She spoke in broken English, her voice barely above a whisper, as if afraid that speaking too loudly might summon unwanted attention. "You go to see cel care nu doam? The one who does not sleep?" I nodded, and she pressed the crucifix into my palm. The wood was warm, as if it had been held close to a fire, and carved with symbols that predated Christianity by millennia. "He comes to the village on nights when the moon dies," she continued, glancing nervously at the darkening sky. "Stands at the crossroads, waiting. Those who follow him into the mountains, they change. They come back different, empty, like shells that something else has learned to wear." She pointed toward a trail that led up into the dense forest, barely visible in the gathering dusk. 3 hours walk, maybe 4. The path is old, older than the monastery, older than the village, older than the church. Follow the stone markers, but do not stray from the path. Other things live in those woods, hungrier things. I thanked her and began the hike as the sun was setting, my pack loaded with supplies for several days and weapons for considerably longer. The trail was barely more than a deer path, winding through ancient trees that seemed to lean inward, as if trying to block out the sky. The forest felt wrong somehow, too quiet, too still, as if every natural sound had been muffled by some invisible presence. The stone markers she had mentioned were weathered cairns that jutted from the earth like broken teeth. Some bore crude Christian crosses, hastily carved as if by travellers seeking protection. Others displayed symbols I didn't recognize, spirals and angular designs that seemed to shift and change when observed from different angles. As night fell, I could have sworn the carvings began to glow with a faint phosphorescence that had nothing to do with the reflected moonlight. The deeper I went into the forest, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The air grew thick and heavy, carrying scents that had no place in a natural environment. Incense and decay, old parchment, and something sweetly organic that reminded me of flowers left too long in stagnant water. Whispers seemed to follow me, carried on wind that touched no leaves, speaking words in languages that predated human speech. Footsteps paralleled my own, staying just out of sight in the underbrush. When I stopped to listen, the sounds would stop as well. When I resumed walking, they would begin again, maintaining perfect synchronization with my pace. The feeling of being watched by countless unseen eyes grew stronger with each step until I found myself constantly checking over my shoulder, despite knowing I would see nothing. I made camp in a small clearing perhaps 2 hours into the hike, building a fire more for psychological comfort than warmth. As the flames danced, I found myself seeing faces in the smoke, some human, others decidedly not. The fire seemed to burn longer and brighter than it should have, given the amount of fuel I had provided, and the shadows it cast moved independently of the flames that created them. Sleep came fitfully, filled with dreams of stone corridors and chanting voices. I dreamed of walking through vast underground chambers where the walls pulsed with veins of light, where altars carved from living bone held chalices that reflected scenes from histories that had never happened. In my dreams, I heard my own voice speaking words I had never learned, in languages that had died before human civilization began. I woke before dawn to find my fire had gone out, though the coals were still warm to the touch. Around the cold ashes, bare footprints circled my campsite, human feet that had approached to within inches of where I slept, then retreated back into the darkness. The prints were deep and clear in the soft earth, but they showed no sign of having been made by someone wearing shoes. More disturbing still, the feet that had made them appeared to have too many toes. The final hours of the hike took me up increasingly steep terrain, following a path that switchbacked along the edge of sheer cliffs. The air grew thin and cold, filled with mist that seemed to rise from the rocks themselves rather than from any natural weather pattern. And through that mist, as I rounded a final bend in the trail, the monastery appeared like something from a fever dream. It rose from the mountainside as if it had grown there, rather than been built, its Gothic spires reaching toward a sky that seemed perpetually overcast in this place. The stone walls were blackened with age and moisture, covered in moss and lichen that gave the entire structure a diseased appearance. Gargoyles leered from the corners of buildings, their features worn smooth by centuries of weather, but still unmistakably malevolent. Their eyes seemed to track my movement as I approached, and I caught myself checking repeatedly to ensure they hadn't actually turned their heads. The architecture defied logical analysis. Windows appeared at heights that couldn't correspond to any internal floor plan. Towers twisted in directions that hurt to contemplate. Buttresses supported structures that should have collapsed under their own weight, yet somehow maintained impossible stability. The entire complex seemed to exist in deliberate violation of physical laws, as if it had been designed by minds that operated according to different principles of reality. The scent that had been growing stronger throughout my hike reached overwhelming intensity as I approached the main entrance. Damp stone and rotting wood. But underneath that, something else. Something sweet and cloying, like incense mixed with decay. It was the smell of old death, of things that should have been buried long ago, but had somehow remained above ground, growing stranger and more potent with each passing year. The heavy wooden doors of the main entrance stood open, as if I were expected. They were massive things, carved from trees that must have been ancient when Christ walked the earth, decorated with religious scenes that had been subtly altered in ways that transformed worship into something approaching blasphemy. The Last Supper showed 13 figures at the table, but the 13th sat in shadow with features that seemed to shift when observed directly. The crucifixion depicted 3 crosses, but the central figure bore a face that was definitely not Christ, and the expression on that face suggested the crucifixion had been willing, even eager. I drew my pistol and approached cautiously, every instinct screaming that I was walking into a trap, but my orders were clear, and I had never failed in a mission. The church had trained me well, and my faith had been tested in fires that would have broken lesser men. The interior of the monastery was a study in deliberate decay. The entrance hall stretched impossibly long, lined with frescoes that had been systematically defaced in ways that suggested purpose rather than random vandalism. Tar had been used to obliterate the faces of saints and angels, leaving only fragments of halos and wings visible in the flickering candlelight. Where divine figures had once inspired worship, now only shadows and suggestions of something far more sinister remained. But the defacement wasn't complete. In some places, new figures had been painted over the old, tall, gaunt forms with eyes that seemed to follow movement, holding objects that might have been chalices, or might have been something else entirely. The artistic style was masterful, clearly the work of someone with extensive training in religious art, but the subject matter belonged in no Christian church I had ever seen. My footsteps echoed through empty corridors as I explored the ground floor, the sound seeming to carry farther than the architecture should have allowed. The electricity worked sporadically, with lights that flickered on and off, seemingly at random, casting dancing shadows that moved independently of their sources. In the refectory, I found evidence of recent meals, bread that was still warm to the touch, wine that hadn't yet turned to vinegar, fruit that showed no signs of decay despite the monastery's apparent abandonment. The kitchen showed signs of regular use, with pots still warm on an ancient stove, and the lingering aroma of recently cooked food. But there were too many place settings, too much food for any reasonable number of inhabitants. And some of the dishes contained ingredients I couldn't identify. Red meat that looked like nothing I'd ever seen, vegetables with textures that seemed almost crystalline, bread that felt warm and seemed to pulse gently when touched. As I explored further, I began to notice other disturbing details. Portraits lined the corridors, all depicting the same figure, a tall, gaunt priest with penetrating eyes, and a smile that suggested knowledge of secrets better left unlearned. The paintings were clearly the work of different artists from different eras, spanning what appeared to be centuries, yet they all showed the same man in exactly the same state of preservation. It was in the chapel that I encountered the first of the monastery's current inhabitants. Brother Thomas stood motionless before the altar, his back to me as I entered. He was a small man, perhaps 60 years old, wearing the traditional brown robes of his order. The fabric was old but clean, well maintained despite its obvious age. When I called out to him, he turned slowly, and I saw that his eyes had been sewn shut with black thread. The stitches were old, healed, suggesting this mutilation had been performed long ago and had been allowed to heal naturally. Despite his blindness, he smiled directly at me with perfect accuracy, as if he could see me more clearly than any sighted person ever had. "Father Mallory," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying clearly through the chapel's acoustic space. "Father Simeon has been expecting you. He's been preparing for your arrival since before you were born." I kept my hand near my weapon as I studied this strange monk, noting details that trained observation had taught me to catch. His breathing was wrong, too slow, too regular, as if it was something he had to consciously remember to do. His skin had a waxy quality that spoke of preservation rather than natural health, and when he moved, he cast no shadow on the stone floor behind him. "Where is he?" I asked, my voice echoing strangely in the vast space of the chapel. "Close," Brother Thomas replied, still wearing that unsettling smile. "He knows you're here. He's known since you left Rome. He felt your footsteps on the path, heard your prayers in the forest, tasted your faith on the mountain air." He paused, tilting his head as if listening to something I couldn't hear. "Would you like me to take you to him?" Against every tactical instinct I possessed, I nodded. Brother Thomas moved with surprising confidence for a blind man, leading me through corridors that seemed to rearrange themselves when I wasn't paying direct attention. The walls were lined with more portraits, more frescoes, more religious art that had been subtly altered to serve purposes that had nothing to do with Christian worship. We passed other monks along the way, perhaps a dozen in total, and every single one had been blinded in the same deliberate manner. All wore the same peaceful expression, all moved with the easy confidence of men who knew every stone in these walls. When they sensed my presence, they would turn toward me with those sewn-shut eyes and smile with genuine warmth, as if welcoming a long-lost brother home from an extended journey. "How long have you been here?" I asked Brother Thomas as we walked. "Time moves differently in this place," he replied without turning around. "Some of us have been here since before the Reformation. Others arrived just yesterday. But we all serve the same purpose now, follow the same calling, work toward the same glorious end." We stopped before a heavy wooden door carved with religious scenes that had been altered in subtle but deeply disturbing ways. The wood itself seemed to pulse gently, as if alive, and the carvings appeared to move slightly when observed peripherally. The door had no visible lock or handle, yet it swung open at Brother Thomas's approach with a sound like a sigh of relief. "He waits within," Brother Thomas said, then walked away without another word, humming a melody that sounded familiar but which I couldn't quite place. I stepped through the doorway to find myself in what must have once been the abbot's private study. Tall windows looked out over the monastery's inner courtyard, their glass so thick with grime and age that they admitted only dim, filtered light. But that light seemed to move strangely, forming patterns that suggested intelligence rather than random refraction. Bookshelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, filled with volumes in languages I couldn't identify. The leather bindings were cracked and stained with substances I preferred not to examine too closely, and some of the books seemed to whisper quietly to themselves when I wasn't looking directly at them. A few had pages that fluttered gently despite the complete absence of any breeze. At the room's centre sat a simple wooden desk that looked ancient enough to predate the monastery itself. The wood was dark with age and carved with symbols that seemed to rearrange themselves when observed directly. And behind that desk sat Father Simeon Petru. He looked exactly as he did in every photograph I'd studied. Not older, not changed by the decades that had supposedly passed, but identical in every detail. His dark hair showed no trace of grey. His face was unlined by age or worry. His eyes held the same burning intensity that had once made him the Vatican's most promising theologian. But there was something else in those eyes now. Something that spoke of knowledge gained and prices paid. "Father Mallory," he said, rising from his chair with fluid grace that seemed to defy the normal limitations of human movement. His voice carried a slight Romanian accent that seemed to caress each syllable. "You've travelled such a long way. Please sit. You must be tired." I remained standing, my hand resting on my holstered weapon. "Father Simeon Petru, I presume?" "Among other names, yes," he replied, moving around the desk with movements that seemed almost dance-like in their precision. "Though I suspect you know very little about who I truly am, or why you've really been sent here." "I know enough. You're a heretic who's been dabbling in forbidden knowledge. My orders are to eliminate you and destroy whatever blasphemous materials you've been studying." Simeon laughed, a sound like silver bells, touched with madness. The sound seemed to hang in the air longer than it should have, creating harmonics that resonated in my bones. "Eliminate me? Oh, Adrian, may I call you Adrian? You have no idea what you're truly dealing with, do you? They sent you here with your blessed bullets and your sanctified blade, thinking you could simply walk into this place and end 40 years of careful work with a few well-placed shots." He gestured towards the bookshelves surrounding us, and I noticed that his shadow on the wall behind him moved independently of his body, forming shapes that had too many angles. "Do you see these texts? Each one represents centuries of accumulated knowledge. Gospels that were suppressed not because they were false, but because they were too true. Accounts of what really happened in the desert, of what Christ truly taught his inner circle, of the prices that must be paid for genuine transcendence." "Heretical nonsense," I said, though something in his tone made my hand tighten on my weapon's grip. "Is it?" Simeon moved closer, and I caught his scent. Old parchment and something else, something organic and slightly sweet, like flowers left too long in water. "Tell me, Adrian, in all your years of service to the church, have you never wondered why certain books were excluded from the canonical Bible? Why certain gospels were declared apocryphal and ordered destroyed? Why the church worked so hard to suppress knowledge that could lead the faithful to greater understanding?" He reached for one of the volumes on his desk, a thick book bound in what looked disturbingly like human skin. The leather was pale and smooth, marked with what might have been old scars, or might have been deliberate patterns. When he touched it, the book seemed to pulse gently, as if responding to contact with living flesh. This particular text was dictated by one who walked with Christ, who witnessed the true nature of his message before it was sanitized for mass consumption. Would you like to know what it says about death, Adrian? About resurrection? About the price of eternal life? I didn't come here for a theological debate. No, you came here to kill me. And you will try, Adrian. You will try many times using every method at your disposal. But first, let me show you something that might change your perspective on this mission. He opened the ancient book to a page covered in text written in dark ink that seemed to shift and move on the page. The language was nothing I recognized from my extensive theological studies, but somehow I could understand fragments of it. Words about sacrifice and transformation, about the thin places where reality wore our gossamer thin, about entities that existed in the spaces between seconds. This monastery was built on one of those thin places, Simeon explained, tracing the text with one finger. As he did so, the words seemed to glow faintly, responding to his touch, a spot where the barrier between worlds is delicate as spun glass. The monks who originally established this place knew that. They came here not to hide from the world, but to access something beyond it. I drew my pistol, pointing it directly at his chest. The weight of the weapon felt comforting in my hands, solid and real, in a place where reality seemed increasingly negotiable. "Enough, I've heard enough." Simeon smiled, spreading his arms wide in a gesture that was part welcome, part crucifixion. Then, "Do what you came to do, Father Mallory. Pull that trigger. Send me to whatever judgment awaits. But know this, you are not the first they have sent. You will not be the last. And your mission here is not what you believe it to be." I hesitated for just a moment, studying his face for any sign of fear or deception. I found neither. Instead, there was something that might have been pity, or perhaps anticipation. His eyes held depths that seemed to go on forever, and in those depths I caught glimpses of things that had no business existing in any sane universe. "In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti," I whispered, and squeezed the trigger. The gunshot was deafening in the confined space of the study. The blessed bullet took Simeon center mass, the impact throwing him backward over his chair. He hit the floor hard, blood spreading across the ancient wooden boards in patterns that seemed to form recognizable shapes, crosses and spirals, and other geometric forms that made my eyes water to follow. The metallic scent of blood mixed with the room's other odors, creating a combination that was somehow both nauseating and oddly appealing. I approached carefully, weapon still drawn, checking for signs of life. His pulse was gone, his breathing had stopped, his eyes stared sightlessly at the ceiling. I'd seen enough death to recognize it with absolute certainty. Father Simeon Petru was dead. I spent the next hour searching his study methodically, gathering the heretical texts and materials for destruction. The books felt wrong in my hands. Too warm, too heavy, as if they contained more than just paper and ink. Some seemed to resist being moved, clinging to their shelves with supernatural tenacity. Others whispered protests in languages that predated human speech. The book he had shown me seemed to be the centerpiece of his collection. When I touched it, images flashed through my mind. Visions of vast underground chambers where impossible things performed rituals that violated every law of physics and theology. I wrapped it carefully in blessed cloth, though the fabric seemed to smoke slightly where it contacted the binding. The furnace in the monastery's basement was ancient but functional, a massive iron construction that looked capable of cremating more than just books. I fed the heretical texts into its flames one by one, watching as centuries of forbidden knowledge turned to ash and smoke. The fire burned with colours that had no names, and the smoke formed patterns that seemed meaningful in ways I couldn't comprehend. Simeon's body burned last. I dragged it down to the furnace room and consigned it to the flames, watching as the flesh consumed cleanly, almost eagerly, as if it had been waiting for this purification. The fire seemed to burn brighter and hotter as it consumed him, and for a moment I could have sworn I heard laughter echoing from the flames. As I climbed back up from the basement, I encountered Brother Thomas in the corridor. He was carrying a tray of bread and wine, moving with the same confident navigation that seemed impossible for a blind man. "Is it finished?" he asked, though his sewn-shut eyes seemed to look right through me. "Yes," I replied. "Father Simeon is dead. The heretical materials have been destroyed." Brother Thomas smiled that same peaceful smile. "Good. He was expecting this. We all were. The work can continue now." Something in his tone made me uneasy, but I was exhausted from the day's events and eager to complete my mission. I spent that night in one of the monastery's guest cells, a small stone room with a narrow window that looked out over the inner courtyard. Through the glass, I watched the remaining monks moving in the darkness below, performing some silent ritual that involved no words, only gestures that seemed to bend the shadows around them in impossible ways. Sleep came eventually, filled with dreams that felt more like memories. I dreamed of walking through vast underground chambers where the walls pulsed with networks of veins that carried light instead of blood. I dreamed of altars carved from substances that weren't quite stone, holding chalices that reflected scenes from histories that had never happened. In my dreams, I heard voices speaking in harmonies that no human throat could produce, chanting words that rewrote reality with each syllable. I woke the next morning to the sound of someone humming in the corridor outside my cell. The melody was cheerful and familiar, though I couldn't place where I had heard it before. I dressed quickly and opened the door to investigate. Father Simeon Petru walked past my doorway, carrying a tray of bread and wine. He was humming softly to himself, the same melody that had awakened me, and when he saw me standing in the doorway, he smiled as if greeting an old friend returning from a long journey. "Good morning, Adrian. I trust you slept well. Breakfast is ready when you are." I stared at him in shock that quickly transformed into something approaching horror. There were no burn marks on his clothes, no bullet wound in his chest, no trace of blood anywhere on his person. My pistol still showed one round fired. The acrid smell of gunpowder still lingered in my memory of the previous evening, but Simeon Petru stood before me, whole and unchanged and absolutely, impossibly alive. "This can't be happening," I whispered, my hand moving instinctively toward my weapon. "Can't it?" Simeon set down the tray and studied my face with what might have been compassion. "You're going to discover, Adrian, that the concept of impossibility is highly subjective in this place. What your church teaches about the nature of death and resurrection, well, let's just say their understanding is somewhat limited." He turned and began walking down the corridor, calling back over his shoulder, "Come, let's have breakfast together. We have much to discuss, and I suspect you're going to have many questions." I followed him in a daze, my mind struggling to process what I had witnessed. The refectory was exactly as I had seen it the day before. Long wooden tables arranged in neat rows, sunlight streaming through tall windows, the lingering aroma of fresh bread and wine. But now it was occupied by the blind monks, perhaps a dozen of them, all eating in perfect silence, while their sewn-shut eyes seemed to track my movement with impossible precision. Simeon gestured to an empty chair across from his own at the head table. "Please sit. You must be hungry after yesterday's exertions." I remained standing, my hand resting on my weapon. "What are you?" "I am what I chose to become," he replied, breaking bread with hands that showed no tremor despite having been dead less than 12 hours earlier. 42 years ago, when I found the text that brought me to this place, I was given a choice. I could report my findings to Rome, allow the Church to destroy yet another source of inconvenient truth, or I could embrace what I had discovered and transcend the limitations that bind ordinary men. "You made a pact with something unholy." "Unholy?" Simeon laughed, that same silver bell sound that seemed to hang in the air. "Adrian, you speak as if you understand the nature of holiness, as if the Church that sent you here has any genuine comprehension of the sacred." He gestured around the refectory, at the blind monks eating their silent meal. "These men have seen the face of the divine and found it so beautiful that mortal sight could not contain it. They chose blindness rather than lose that vision." I drew my pistol again, aiming it directly at his head this time. "I don't care what blasphemous nonsense you've convinced yourself to believe. My orders were clear." Yes, they were. Kill the heretic. Destroy the forbidden knowledge. Return to Rome with confirmation that the threat has been eliminated. Simeon took a sip of wine, completely ignoring the weapon pointed at his skull. "But consider this, Adrian, if I can return from death, what makes you think your bullets will be any more effective on the second attempt, or the third, or the 20th? He was right, of course, but I fired anyway. The bullet caught him just above the left eye, snapping his head back and spraying blood across the wall, behind him. His body toppled from the chair, twitching once before going still. The blind monks continued eating, as if nothing had happened, their sewn-shut eyes never turning toward the sound of gunfire. I checked his pulse, confirmed his death, then dragged his body back to the furnace room. This time, I made sure the cremation was complete, stirring the ashes until nothing remained but fine grey powder that I scattered to the mountain winds. The next morning, Father Simeon Petru greeted me at breakfast with a bandage wrapped around his head, where the bullet had entered. "Sleep better last night?" he asked cheerfully, as if we were discussing the weather rather than his impossible resurrection. I find that the second death is always easier to accept than the first. The mind begins to adapt to new realities. Over the following days, I attempted every method of execution I knew. I stabbed him through the heart with my consecrated blade, watching him bleed out on the chapel floor, while the blind monks continued their eternal chanting. The next morning, I found him tending a small garden behind the monastery, humming that same melodic tune, while roses bloomed in soil that should have been frozen. I pushed him from the bell tower, hearing the sickening impact of his body against the stones of the courtyard below. His neck was clearly broken, his limbs twisted at impossible angles, blood pooling beneath his shattered skull, in patterns that seemed to spell words in languages I didn't recognize. But that evening, he joined me for dinner in the refectory, engaging in pleasant conversation about theological matters, as if his spine hadn't been snapped in 3 places just hours earlier. I tried fire, drowning, decapitation, dismemberment. Each death was real. I confirmed them thoroughly, checking for pulse and breath, examining the wounds, ensuring beyond any doubt that Simeon Petru had died. Each resurrection was equally real, equally impossible to deny, equally maddening in its casual defiance of everything I understood about the nature of life and death. The monastery began to change around me during this period, or perhaps I was simply noticing changes that had always been there. Corridors seemed to stretch longer than they should, with distances that varied depending on my state of mind or the time of day. Doors appeared where walls had existed previously, leading to rooms that couldn't possibly fit within the building's external dimensions. Some of these new rooms contained things that challenged my understanding of reality. A library filled with books that wrote themselves, their pages covered with text that changed depending on who was reading it. A chapel where the crucified figure on the altar bore a face that was definitely not Christ, and where the stained glass windows showed scenes from Gospels that had never been written. A laboratory where Brother Thomas and others worked with equipment that seemed to blend medieval alchemy with technologies that wouldn't be invented for centuries. My Bible, which I had read every morning as part of my devotional routine for over 2 decades, began exhibiting disturbing alterations. Some days the pages would be completely blank, the familiar text having somehow vanished overnight. Other days the passages I knew by heart would be replaced by scripture written in languages that made my head pound to examine. Verses about love and redemption were replaced by instructions for rituals that required specific types of sacrifice performed under particular astronomical conditions. On the 5th day, I found Brother Thomas in the monastery's scriptorium, a room lined with desks where the monks had once copied manuscripts by hand. He was seated at one of these desks, his sewn-shut eyes somehow allowing him to work on an illuminated manuscript with impossible precision. His fingers moved across the parchment like a master artist's, adding intricate details to biblical scenes that had been subtly altered to serve different purposes. "You're beginning to understand," he said without looking up from his work, "the true nature of your mission here." I grabbed him by the shoulders, my frustration and growing fear finally boiling over. What is he? What kind of creature survives death again and again? Brother Thomas set down his pen and turned his blind face toward me. Despite the black thread holding his eyelids closed, I had the distinct impression he was looking directly into my eyes, seeing things that normal sight could never perceive. "He is what he chose to become when he found the gospel of the 13th hour," Thomas said calmly. "A man who discovered that death is not an ending, but a doorway. That resurrection is not a miracle reserved for prophets, but a skill that can be learned by those willing to pay the price." "What price? What are you talking about?" "The cup from which Christ truly drank on the night before his crucifixion. Not the sanitized version your church teaches, but the real sacrament. The one that requires sacrifice, demands transformation, offers genuine transcendence to those brave enough to empty themselves completely." Thomas returned to his manuscript, adding delicate touches of gold leaf to the halo of a figure that bore an uncomfortable resemblance to Simeon. "Every death you give him feeds the thing that sleeps below these mountains. Every resurrection strengthens the connection between this world and the one that waits beyond. You think you're here to destroy him, Adrian, but you're actually here to complete his work." "That's impossible. The Vatican would never knowingly send agents to participate in heretical rituals." "Wouldn't they?" Thomas's needle-like pen scratched across the parchment, adding details that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. "Consider the logic, Adrian. How many times have they sent agents like you to deal with problems that conventional methods cannot solve? How many of those agents have returned with reports of successful missions? And how many of those supposed successes have actually eliminated the threats they were sent to address?" The implications of his words hit me like a physical blow. I thought of the other missions I had undertaken over the years, the heretical priests and blasphemous scholars I had eliminated in service to the church. How many of those targets had actually died? How many had I simply fed? "You're lying," I said, but my voice lacked conviction. "Am I? Then explain this." Thomas reached into his robes and produced a leather journal. Its pages yellowed with age. "This belonged to your predecessor, Father Michael O'Brien. He arrived here 5 years ago, with the same orders you carry, the same blessed weapons, the same absolute faith in his mission." I took the journal with trembling hands. The handwriting was neat and precise in the early entries, documenting O'Brien's arrival at the monastery and his first encounters with Simeon. But as the days passed, the script became increasingly erratic, the observations more disturbing. Day 7. Killed the target for the 3rd time, used the consecrated blade, confirmed death by decapitation, found him the next morning reading scripture in the library, beginning to suspect supernatural intervention. Day 12. Attempted burning the target alive, watched his flesh consume completely, scattered the ashes. He appeared at dinner, unmarked. The other monks treat this as completely normal. Something is very wrong here. Day 18. Found additional journals in the catacombs. Previous investigators dating back centuries. All report the same phenomenon. All eventually stop trying to kill him. What happened to them? Day 25. The target claims each death I inflict makes something stronger. Spoke of an entity that sleeps beneath the mountain, waiting to wake. Says my faith is what feeds it, not my violence. I don't understand. Day 31. Explored the deep chambers below the monastery. Found things that cannot be real. Altars carved from living bone. Walls that pulse like heartbeats. The chained figures. Dear God, the chained figures all have my face. The journal shook in my hands as I read the final entry. Day 37. I understand now why they really sent me here, not to destroy Simeon, but to feed what he serves. Each death I give him opens the door a little wider. Each resurrection brings the sleeper closer to waking. I can hear it now, down in the deepest places, stirring in response to our ritual. Tomorrow, I will ask Brother Thomas to sew my eyes shut. Some truths are too bright for human sight. The work will continue. The faithful will serve. They always have. They always will. I dropped the journal as if it had burst into flames. This is insane, impossible. Is it? Thomas picked up the journal and carefully placed it back in his robes. Tell me, Adrian, have you noticed anything strange about your weapons? Your blessed ammunition? The way they seem to work perfectly against the target, yet accomplish nothing. Now that he mentioned it, I had noticed. Every shot was accurate. Every blade thrust found its mark. Every method of execution succeeded completely. Yet Simeon continued to return, unmarked and unchanged. It was as if my weapons were designed to kill him in very specific ways, as if the entire process had been choreographed in advance. The church knows, I whispered, the horrible truth finally penetrating my consciousness. They know he can't be killed. They know what he is, what he serves. They've been sending agents here for decades, maybe centuries, to feed it. Now you're beginning to understand. Thomas's sewn-shut eyes seemed to focus on something beyond the physical world. The entity that sleeps beneath this mountain predates human civilization. It requires faith to wake, not the simple belief of ignorant masses, but the tested, refined faith of men who have devoted their lives to serving the divine. Your deaths, and there will be many more, provide exactly the sort of spiritual energy it needs. I spent the rest of that day in my cell, trying to process the implications of what I had learned. Everything I had believed about my mission, about my purpose, about the organization I served, had been built on lies. I was not a warrior for the church, but a sacrifice being offered to something that existed in opposition to everything the church claimed to represent. As evening approached, I heard footsteps in the corridor outside my door. Slow, measured steps that stopped directly in front of my cell. I knew who it was before I opened the door. Father Simeon stood in the hallway, but he was different now. His form seemed to flicker between flesh and shadow. His voice carried harmonics that no human throat could produce, and his eyes held depths that seemed to contain entire universes of forbidden knowledge. Are you ready to see the truth, Adrian? The real truth, not the comfortable lies your church has fed you. I wanted to refuse, I wanted to maintain some semblance of the faith that had sustained me through 15 years of dark work. But I'd come too far, learned too much, to turn back now. Show me, I said. He led me through passages I had never seen before, down stairs that descended far deeper than the monastery's foundations should have allowed. The walls here were older than the building above, carved from living rock and decorated with symbols that predated human civilization. Some passages contained the remains of ancient burials, while others held artifacts that had no business existing in any Christian structure. The deeper we went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The air grew thick and warm, carrying scents of incense and organic decay that reminded me of battlefields where the dead had been left too long in the sun. Whispers seemed to follow us, speaking in languages that bypassed my ears and resonated directly in my bones. The monastery was built on this site for a reason, Simeon explained as we descended. The original builders knew what lay beneath, knew what could be accessed here. They established their order not to worship the Christ of mainstream Christianity, but to serve something far older and more powerful. We passed chambers filled with books and scrolls, laboratories where Brother Thomas and others worked with strange equipment, cells that contained figures I preferred not to examine too closely. Everything was lit by torches that burned with flames that cast no heat, their light revealing details that normal illumination would have left hidden. For centuries they maintained the secret, Simeon continued, passing knowledge from generation to generation, preparing for the day when the sleeper would wake. But they needed something more than just human devotion. They needed the concentrated faith of those who had been tested in the fires of absolute belief. The final chamber defied description in any language I knew. It was vast beyond measurement, its ceiling lost in shadows that seemed to move independently of any light source. The walls pulsed like living tissue, covered in a network of veins or roots that throbbed with a rhythm that matched my own heartbeat. The air itself seemed alive, thick with potential energy that made my skin crawl and my teeth ache. At the chamber's center stood an altar carved from something that wasn't quite stone. It was white and organic, radiating warmth like living bone, covered in symbols that seemed to rearrange themselves when I wasn't looking directly at them. The altar was stained with substances I didn't want to identify, and on its surface sat a chalice that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. But it was what surrounded the altar that truly shattered my remaining grip on sanity. Chained to the walls in positions that mimicked crucifixion were dozens of human forms. Some wore the robes of monks, others the suits of modern investigators, still others the armor of medieval knights. All were in various states of preservation, some recent enough that decay had barely begun, others reduced to little more than bones and dried skin, held together by rusted chains. And every single one of them had my face. Not similar features, not family resemblances, but identical faces. The same eyes, the same bone structure, the same scars I had acquired over my years of service to the church. As I stared in growing horror, I realized they were all still alive, their chests rising and falling in shallow breaths, their mouths moving in silent screams or prayers, their eyes tracking my movement with desperate recognition. Every generation, Simeon's voice came from behind me, but when I turned, he was no longer entirely human. His form flickered between flesh and shadow, his features shifting like smoke in wind. They send someone. Every generation that someone discovers the truth. Every death you have given me has awakened one of your predecessors. Adrian. They are all you, in a sense, all aspects of the same faithful soul, sent again and again to serve the same purpose. I tried to run, but the chamber seemed to stretch around me, the exit receding with each desperate step. The chained figures were stirring now, their mouths opening in a chorus of voices that all carried the same timbre as my own. "No," I whispered, but my voice was lost in their growing choir. "This isn't possible. This isn't real." "Reality is negotiable in this place," Simeon said, his laughter no longer entirely sane. "The thing that sleeps has been waiting since before your Christ walked the earth. It requires faith to wake. Not the simple belief of ignorant masses, but the tested, refined faith of men who have devoted their lives to serving the divine. Your deaths, and there will be many more, will provide the final ingredient needed for its awakening. The blessed blade appeared in my hand. When had I drawn it? I couldn't remember. I felt it slide between my ribs with shocking ease, pain exploding through my chest as I looked down to see my own hands driving the consecrated steel deeper into my heart. But they weren't my hands. The figure standing before me, holding the knife's grip, wore my face but smiled with Simeon's expression of patient hunger. Around us, the chained forms were singing now, their voices rising in harmonies that hurt to hear, calling to something vast and ancient that stirred in response. As darkness closed in around me, I heard my own voice speaking words I had never learned, in languages that had died before human civilization began. The thing beneath the mountain was waking, pressing against barriers that had held it for millennia, feeding on the faith and fear and desperate hope of faithful men sent to do impossible tasks. Time became meaningless. I existed in a state between death and life, awareness and oblivion, floating in darkness that was shot through with veins of light that pulsed in rhythm with something enormous and patient and hungry. Sometimes I could see the chamber where my body hung chained to ancient stone. Sometimes I could see other chambers where other versions of myself performed the same eternal ritual. Sometimes I could see nothing but the vast presence that waited in the deep places of the earth. Gradually I became aware that I was standing again. The monastery's chapel surrounded me, exactly as it had been when I first arrived. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, illuminating the altar where Brother Thomas knelt in prayer. But my eyes had been sewn shut with black thread, the stitches old and healed, and somehow I could see everything with perfect clarity. In my hands were candles that burned with flames that cast no heat. I was lighting them one by one, preparing for the arrival of the next investigator, Father Gabriel Thorne, according to the intelligence reports that somehow appeared in my mind without having been read. A young priest, devoted and pure, sent by Cardinal Francesco to deal with reports of a heretical priest named Simeon Petru. When Father Thorne asked about Simeon's whereabouts, I smiled with the same peaceful expression Brother Thomas had once shown me. "He's been expecting you," I said in a voice that sounded like my own, but carried echoes of countless others. "He's been preparing for your arrival since before you were born." I led the new priest through corridors that rearranged themselves with each step, towards the study where Father Simeon waited with patient hunger. Another faithful man, another tested soul, another drop of concentrated belief to feed the awakening process. Brother Adrien, for that was my name now, understood his purpose with crystalline clarity. Each agent who came to this place added their death to the growing collection, their resurrection to the expanding network of power that would eventually shatter the final barriers, keeping the sleeper bound. The work would continue, the cycle would repeat, the faithful would serve as they always had, as they always would, until the day when enough deaths had been offered, enough resurrections achieved, enough concentrated belief harvested to wake the thing that had dreamed in darkness since before the first human looked up at the stars and wondered what looked back. In the village below, an elderly woman felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. She held a wooden crucifix tighter and whispered prayers to a God who might not be listening anymore, or who might be listening too well. On moonless nights, she could see lights in the monastery windows, not the warm glow of candles, but something cold and hungry that pulsed in rhythm with a heartbeat that was not human. The man who does not sleep was waking something that should have remained buried, and faithful men, good men, men who believed in the righteousness of their cause, continued to climb the mountain path to help him do it. One by one, they arrived. One by one, they failed in their sacred mission. One by one, They joined the chorus of voices that sang to the thing beneath, calling it back to a world that would soon remember why ancient peoples had built their temples far from certain mountains, why old maps marked some regions with warnings written in dead languages, why the church had worked so hard to suppress certain texts that spoke of entities that existed before creation itself. The work was almost complete. The faithful had served their purpose admirably. Soon, very soon, the sleeper would wake, and the world would discover what it truly meant to have faith in something vast and alien and hungry. Brother Adrien lit another candle, hummed another verse of the song that had no ending, and waited for the next faithful soul to arrive. The mountain was patient. The monastery was patient. The thing beneath was patient. But it would not wait much longer.